All right, we'll keep checking people in as we go, but it's time to get it going here. And so good morning all. For those who don't know me, my name is Darren Morgan. I'm nursery manager at Chenard's Nursery here in Corvallis, Oregon. And today's topic is on continuing the summer garden. And I just want to preface it, as I see from the chat bar, and this has been kind of an ongoing thing for the last year and a half of these Zoom classes. We do have guests attending from different regions, not our immediate local region. And I just want to put that caveat in there up front that, you know, if you're in the South or you're in the very far North, or if you're in Europe or South America or whatever, there will be some variation. A lot of the information is still valid, but timing and dates and such are going to be different because we live in significantly different climates. So just bear that in mind as you're attending and listening along, and always refer back to your local gardening experts and or extension services for more detailed information of how this can translate out to your individual climate. So we're going to start off this morning with just a very brief verbal discussion on the continuing of the main summer garden. But the vast part of continuing the garden really is not continuing the summer garden as much as the things you need to do in order to have a good fall, winter, and overwinter garden. And it always sounds kind of funny to talk about the winter garden in July, but this is when we have to be doing it. If you do not get your plants well in and established as early as possible, as early as practical in the season, they won't have time to either mature for a fall harvest or achieve the desired degree of maturity to successfully make it through the winter for winter and overwintered harvests. So that's why the timing on this particular class is what it is. And I know it throws some people who are new to the concept of winter gardening, but what happens now is your winter garden, June, July, and August. By the time you're up into September, the fall, it's too late to really do anything for fall. But to start off with, let's talk a little bit about continuing the summer garden, as it were. So we should be getting into the throes of harvest here in Western Oregon with our moderate climate. Zucchinis and tomatoes and such are beginning to come on. And a number of crops are really finishing up. Crops like peas are aging out due to a combination usually of heat and insect depredation and viruses. Those insects transmit viruses like a peonation virus. So peas are on the decline as we get warmer and warmer. It happened a little fast this year with our 110 degrees in June, but every season's different. You take what you get and move along with it. For the most of your overwintered spring harvest crops and spring planted cole crops like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, the main head harvest is also pretty well finished usually by now. Broccoli may be side shooting nicely for you. It's a good way to have some continued harvest through the summer. But other plants like the cauliflower, when they are harvested out, they are done and need to be removed. We're also in the throes of harvesting of garlic and onions. And as those plants come out, there's some space available for additional fall and winter gardening as well. So harvest is happening. Some things are finishing, other things are active. Those continuous harvest plants, such as tomatoes and pole beans in particular, zucchini and the side sprouting broccolis, are the staples of my edible garden through the summer. A lot of the earlier, larger volumetric harvests all at once with the cauliflower and broccoli, we freeze, and then we'll freeze and can, and then we'll eat the smaller secondary production that's ongoing through the season. So it's not like you don't have any options to do more summer vegetables in this season, but your season is getting very, very limited by now. We're talking right now and going into the third week of July, and tomatoes and peppers and squash plants planted this late are getting pretty iffy about if they will produce anything at all. Leaf crops, on the other hand, such as lettuces and bok choys, can still be produced. We do have to fight the heat a little bit. So there's a tendency for these plantings done this time of year to either stress badly and bolt, or not develop correctly from seed. And that makes a bit of a challenge sometimes to get these plants going. So take advantage of spaces like in the shade of your tomato plants, or in the shade of your corn patch, in the shade of your pole beans, for some of these more heat sensitive crops to continue replanting through the summer, for continuing harvest through the summer and into the fall. On the other hand, bush beans really like being out in the heat. You still have time to manage one single crop. You won't get a reflush, but one single crop anyway of bush beans from a planting in July is very, very likely. Focus on some shorter season varieties like jade at 50 some days. Get out there at 65 and 70 day crops planted in late July are starting to push the margins, because remember, those days on the seed packages are not calendar days, they are degree days. And although we're coming into the hottest part of the summer, our day lengths are already shortening. And so the periods of time of heat versus the periods of time of cooler weather in the evening start transitioning a little bit. And it's not uncommon to not have 65 degree days in 75 plus days as we're getting later and later towards the end of the season. So there are some limits to how far you can go on that, but 50 to 60 day bush beans are fine still. So that's kind of the continuation of the summer crop. Beyond the replanting, the thing you want to focus on as we're going through the season is making sure, as you have these extended season crops, you watch the weather as we really progress into the fall, so that you can, if need be, cover those tomatoes to get the last few of them ripe, or perhaps pick them at sub-ripe, pick them when they're just showing a little bit of color past green, if we have a lot of rain coming in the early fall or predicted early frosts, so that you can still ripen them indoors and still save the harvest, because that becomes dicey as we get later and later into the season. That's really the focus of continuing the summer garden. But the big focus of this talk really is the fall and winter gardens, and that's what we're going to get into now. So as I said at the outset, it's kind of a weird time to think about it, and there are some challenges to planting this in this kind of weather, but this is the fall and winter garden here. So when we look at the concept of year-round gardening in the Pacific Northwest, winter garden is not a simple one-topic thing. Winter garden is really three groups of plants. We have groups of plants that are fall harvest plants, a lot of root and cole crops that harvest between roughly early October and roughly the latter part of November, say through Thanksgiving. And this includes leaf, cole, and root crops. There's also a much smaller group of plants that are harvested actively in the winter, between the end of November and maybe the end of January, first part of February. Not very many crops, but there are some out there that harvest in that cycle. And lastly, and still not a huge topic, overwintered crops. Crops that you're planting now that you will grow through the fall, through the winter, to harvest next year, usually sometime between March and maybe June or July in a few cases. So that's what your year-round garden is, and we're going to kind of break it out into sections like that, so you can see how they work and how they can fit into your harvest profiles. So we'll start off with the fall harvest. Fall harvest includes both the extending harvest, the getting all the summer crops off, because in the Pacific Northwest, our summer crops like zucchinis and like tomatoes will continue through September most years, though with slowly decreasing volumes. Usually sometime between late December and maybe the middle of October, those crops are finally failing, either not growing fast enough to continue producing, or getting into weather issues such as rain splitting on tomatoes, or even light frost damage by the middle of October on many plants. So there's quite a few crops that are still in extended harvest into this cycle. In the actual fall harvest cycle, we have also quite a batch of successions of leaf crops and cole crops and root crops, and then a few legumes that can be coming off in that cycle. So cole crops, let's just take a moment and clear our definition. So cole crops can be a really broad term. I'm referring to cole crops primarily as the broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, the ones that you're not just leaf harvesting and not just root harvesting. but members of that cole family, that crucifer family. We'll talk more about the things like kale in the leaf crops and things like tulips and rutabagas in the root crops, even though they're all interrelated plants. So leaf crops in terms of continuing harvest and ongoing planting. Chard and also kale are some of the champion leaf crops for our moderate climates. Chard and kale are true biennial crops here. So you can plant them in the spring, you can plant them in the summer, you can plant them in the fall. And regardless of when in that year you plant them, you'll have some leaf production through the winter, a good flush of leaf production in the spring, and then they try to bolt and then set seed the following year, sometime late spring to early summer. So you can early plant them and have long seasons of harvest from one plantings, or if you didn't have space in your main season garden, you can still plant them in the late summer and fall and still have your fall, winter, and spring harvests off of them. Collards. So collards planted now are going to be ripening just maybe a little warm. You might wait just a little bit on the collards. If you plant them just a little bit later, they're less likely to get too thick or too insect chewed. And they really do hit their peak of flavor after we've had a light frost or two. So don't jump into that one too fast, but it is definitely a fall harvest, not typically a winter harvest plant. Spinach plants, another great leaf crop for a continuing harvest through the season. July plantings will be harvesting usually the very end of September and then going into the winter. With covers, you might be able to get some continuing harvest over the winter. Otherwise, they will really kind of slow down and stunt down in the winter, but typically do resume growth enough in the spring to get a good harvest off in late February, early March. Lettuce is an ongoing crop, and the challenge with lettuce is primarily bolting. The hotter we are, the more likely they are to have enough stresses to try to set seed quickly and go bitter. So you have to time your plantings carefully and repeat plant sequentially through the year as your lettuce fades out from overheating. You can avoid some of this by planting in the shade of taller crops to reduce the heat stress, and by practicing good fertilization and watering practices. Consistent watering and mild light fertilization will tend to keep them growing steadily. Sudden influxes of large volumes of nitrogen or gaps between waterings where they go dry and then wet and then dry and then wet tend to encourage lettuce to bolt, and when it bolts it gets bitter. Don't despair on the first time your lettuce starts trying to set some seed up, some of those seed stalks up. You go through and top out the seeds and then let them reflush. Some of that growth will be just a little bitter. If you harvest it and drop it in ice water right away, then dry it out for storage or for use, you can actually leach out enough of that bitterness to make it palatable if it's not too far along. Really bitter lettuce won't correct, but things of just a little tiny bit of bitter can be fixed. Mustards, and mustard is another big group, includes a wide variety of leaf crops. Typical plantings now and clear into the early fall harvest, from fall through the winter and into the spring. We'll talk a little bit more later in the presentation about strategies for maintaining these continuous harvests, but those are the primary leaf crops we're looking at. Cole crops, plantings. So briefly on cole crops, most cole crops do much better from transplant. If you start late June, early July, you can buy seeds, start your own transplants, get them going, and then transplant them out. Otherwise, buy transplants and plant in July and into maybe early August at the latest to have enough time to still mature these plants. Broccoli, we have plantings now are typically fall harvest, to 60 to 75 days roughly. Insects are a challenge on all cole crops, but broccoli is particularly prone to aphid problems. As are Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts are getting on the end of planting season. We'll often start Brussels a little bit early, but again, don't panic about that. Brussels sprouts that were planted in early May are ripening now. They're not as good. Brussels sprouts is another crop that tastes better after the weather cools down a bit. Brussels sprouts that are planted in mid-July should be harvesting in about November, which is about ideal for harvest conditions. Cabbage plantings now are summer and fall plantings, and cauliflower also summer to fall plantings. In this section, we are talking specifically about fall harvest, but all of these cole crops, the cabbages, the broccolis, and the cauliflowers, have several different maturation cycles. So plants that are all planted at the same time mature at different periods. Plantings done in July of broccoli can be either harvesting summer fall, or harvesting March overwintered or sprouting broccoli. For cabbage and cauliflower, there's 3 harvest groupings, and so there's fall harvest, winter harvest, roughly December, and overwintered harvest, roughly February, March. They're all planted at the same time. It's just different varieties with different maturation dates. Got a question in chat. What zone is this based on? Zone 7, and I worried about planting brassicas would just be eaten up by caterpillars. Yes, we are also zone 7A, we're 7B, 8A here in Corvallis. That is one of the biggest challenges. It is not optional to wait later to avoid the caterpillars. You have to work around and fight them. And we'll talk a bit more about some of the strategies on that a little bit later, but that is a very valid concern. Aphids, beetles, caterpillars, and several types of maggot flies are significant problems with planting for your fall, winter, and overwinter garden, and you do have to work around them. So question in the chat, planting means seeding or sowing, and we're talking about this, and we'll get some time frames on again a little bit later down here, but typically cole crops we are talking about transplanting. Direct sowing them is not impossible, but is a low percentage game. There's a lot of things that can happen to seed in the hot part of the season. Can be difficult to get it to germinate. There's a lot of insect and bird pressure. So not impossible to direct seed broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage. I've done it. Generally speaking, if you want to select your own seed varieties from the seed catalogs, you should be starting them back in mid to late June inside to transplant out now. So fall harvest root crops are the classic things everybody thinks of as major roots. Beets and carrots, turnips and radishes, leeks. So sweet potato is a fun plant to grow here. You can grow several varieties here. It's done fairly commonly. You are really too late by mid-July to plant them. This is a plant you should be doing in mid-June or maybe a little earlier. I do it as early as late May. Those plantings harvest usually the latter part of October. Anytime before we get so wet that they're going to rot or have frost off the foliage a couple of times. They'll tolerate a very light frost. So sweet potato we include because this is their harvest cycle, but this is not their growing cycle. This is something you would have had to have done earlier. So beets and carrots have quite a bit in common in terms of a production cycle. You can be planting them in as early as April or so and be harvesting now. I'm picking carrots right now. You can go through and plant new batches of carrots now, and they'll be harvesting roughly September. You can plant them a little later, end of July, maybe into first part of August, and they'll be harvesting in the fall. Those are crops that actually can store in ground for a bit. The growing slows down quite a bit as our temperatures decline and our day lengths decline. And if you're not in a situation that is too water laden, then you can leave them in the ground, pick a few out at a time as you need them, and not have to pick them all and store them. There are limits to the fun. Insect pressure limits that. The number of insects eat the actual tubers themselves in the ground, and that can be a problem. Also, as I mentioned, wet. In our climate, and particularly here in Corvallis and our clay soils, attempts to store fall harvest crops clear into the winter can sometimes be met with failure just because of the moisture content. Lastly, time is not your friend. Beets and carrots, for most varieties on the carrots, become increasingly fibrous the longer they sit in the ground stationary, and they become unpalatable usually by maybe end of December or so. So you can't hold them in the ground indefinitely. There are exceptions in the carrot world. We'll talk about them a little later. On the other hand, turnips are primarily done as a fall and winter harvest crop. They do hold in the ground fairly well, but they're even more subject to insect depredation. Now, root crops in general we're not talking about transplanting. And there's a couple of spots where we'll make some exceptions. Root crops are usually seeded. So the challenge to that is getting them to germ, to getting germination. When you're 95 degrees every day and you're trying to conserve your water, make good use of your water, keeping enough moisture in that top layer of soil to get good seed germination can be very challenging. You're going to have to either have enough space that is specifically set aside for fall crops and winter crops to be able to irrigate it separately from the rest of the garden to give it the frequency of water germinating seedlings need. Or if you're planting intermixed in the main garden like I do, it means you're going to have to go out there at least every couple of days and supplement, give some additional water above and beyond what any standard irrigation system is providing. Because if you're watering your vegetables correctly for most situations, you're watering every 2 or 3 days with a heavy soak to get the water down. And unfortunately, germinating seedlings might need water every day, or if we get really hot and windy, maybe even twice a day for good germination. So you'll need to pay attention to that for plants that are planted from seed. Radishes are kind of one of those ubiquitous root crops. It's a crop you want to plant a few at a time frequently, because how many radishes you're going to eat all at once? They don't store all that well. And you can plant them all the way from maybe as early as March, all the way through maybe early October, and just do small batches every 2 or 3 weeks. It takes them about 20 days in the peak of the season, it takes about 20 days from seed to harvest, a little bit longer on both ends of that cycle. And you can just plant a few at a time and have a kind of continuous radish supply through the year. You can also use radish to mark your patches or rows for longer germinating plants. And in the fall harvest stuff, that's carrots, and in the winter harvest stuff, that's parsnips. So those are plants that take maybe 21 or 22 days to germinate before any sprouts are visible. And that often leads to problems with hoeing and weed control or other maintenance in the garden, where they get neglected, ignored, or damaged. If you sow your carrots or your parsnips, and then you go right over the top of that planting and you sow radishes, well, your radishes will be up in about 4 days to mark the space that was planted. They'll be in there for about 20 to maybe 30 days, so the whole time of initial germination on the seed of those longer crops. And to boot, they will help you automatically thin by where they're growing. They'll disturb seed germination. Thin those crops so you don't have to thin quite so hard as all those carrots and parsnips come up, and you have to thin them down for adequate spacing. Question in the chat: do row covers help retain moisture for seed? So row covers can help retain moisture for seed, but these seeds are very light sensitive for germination, and typically when I've done that, I've had problems getting with it slowing down the germination too much because it's blocking too much sun coming through. Clear plastic covers will help with germination. Just watch your temperature overload. You can steam your seeds rather than sprout them if you keep it too sealed up too tight. Strategies like that can definitely help with retaining moisture. With carrots planted this time of year, rather than using no mulch or using a sandy mulch on top of the seed to give them a cover, I'll take just a very thin, about an 1/8 inch of potting soil across the top of my plantings. Because potting soils actually hold more moisture than most mulches, compost mulches. And that gives me often enough moisture to improve the germination success rate. Leeks are typically summer to fall or fall to winter harvest. So leeks that are seeded in May or even April mature in the summer and then into the fall. Successively later plantings do develop later in the season, and leeks hold well into the early winter, so they've got a pretty long harvest cycle. Leeks take forever. You have to think well ahead on leeks. Average from seed to harvest on leeks is over 100 days. So it's not like some of these other root crops at 40, 50, 60 days. It does take more time. Yeah, you notice a couple of things missing on this list: parsnips and rutabagas. They're not normally done as fall harvest as such. They're normally a long enough growing cycle to get your best results. They're more of a late fall into winter harvest, and we'll talk about them a couple of slides down here. So legumes. We talked about peas kind of declining out in the heat, and they do, but we are now past the peak problem for mature peas, and younger peas are not as subject to those stresses. If you do a planting in mid to late June of peas, depending on the variety, type and maturation period, you might be harvesting August and September. A planting now in mid to late July will usually manage a harvest September to October if you're not running too slow a developing pea, because there's quite a bit of variation in maturation on peas. It's a good idea to provide some protection or structure for them in any case. They're going to need something to climb on anyway. One strategy you can employ for these plantings is, as you harvest out corn, don't take the stalks out. Cut them about a foot or so off the ground instead, and sow your peas in between the stubble rows. That gives some protection from wind and birds on the peas themselves. Gives them something to get started climbing on, so they have some structure, so they're not just sprawling across the ground. And that can be a very successful way to reutilize some space in the vegetable garden. You can also overwinter peas. We'll talk about that a few slides down. It's a bit more chancy, but it is doable. So winter harvest crops. Winter harvest crops, we're talking about crops that are typically harvested between the latter part of November and maybe the middle of February. Again, there are leaf crops, cole crops, and roots. Most of our roots are ground stored in the sense that they've been mature for a while, and you go through and pick them as you go. There are a few new ones on the list. So winter leaf crops, without using some form of covers, we'll talk about insulative covers much later here in the presentation. Although many leaf crops survive the winter without covers, very few of them produce and grow actively enough to be actually winter harvested. It's very common to grow leaf crops as a fall harvest, gap, and then resprout in the winter crop. Some of your champions in terms of actual winter harvest are kale and collards, and of course arugula. And those, even without cover, will produce some yield clear through the winter. You have to pick lightly if you're going for continuing harvest, particularly on the kale, slowly harvesting the outermost and lowermost leaves and working your way slowly up the stem. If you start taking the tops out of these plants, they won't regrow enough to reproduce, to continue producing new leaves. Regardless of their ability to be produced without protection, even these very hardy plants really do produce better if you use some sort of cover for winter protection. Spinach and chard, the chenopod's, survive most winters here in the valley without covers, but they don't normally harvest over the winter. If you plant them early enough, you get some fall harvest, a gap in the winter, and then a spring harvest on their biennial cycle. Otherwise, plantings done as late as maybe early September are simply done to overwinter and only harvest in the spring. Lettuce does not normally quite make it through the winter. It's real common to be harvesting small amounts of lettuce into December and then it finally failing in late December, early January. With protection, they definitely do. They're right on that bubble of hardiness. And radicchio is kind of like the arugula and collards. Fairly hardy, can be limited winter harvest, more commonly done like the spinach. I've got a fall harvest, left in ground for a reflush in the spring, and then taken out. Radicchio doesn't really benefit too much in terms of winter harvest from covers. It's typically just done as a dormant winter crop. Winter harvested cole crops. So Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts planted in a timely fashion, i.e. now or just a little earlier than now. Particularly some of the longer maturing varieties will produce in the winter, late November or so. And it's not a bad idea to simply leave them standing. Remember that the sprouts mature from bottom up. You can pick a few off and leave the stalk standing, leave all leaves on for additional weather protection. and just harvest them as you need them on up the stems. And they can be left in the garden all winter. They're super hardy. They don't typically peter out here in our winters in Western Oregon. Winter cabbage, still planted at the same time as fall cabbage. Varieties that are specifically selected to mature between roughly late November and maybe the end of January or so. Go out and pick as they develop. You've got to fight the insects on all these cole crops early. As we get into winter, you don't have to be as attentive, but bear in mind, particularly aphids don't go away in the winter here. They're still there. They're not reproducing as fast, but they're still there. Populations are still slowly building. So you can't just completely neglect them once we've had the frost. You still have to pay attention to the aphids even later in the season. Winter cauliflower, like cabbage, they're planted at the same time as fall harvest varieties. They ripen at a later cycle, usually January for most of them. You do need to be aware that cauliflower is nowhere near as hardy as most other cole crops. They need some protection. So fall cauliflower, you're not worried about it. We're not cold enough in November to need to protect them. But by December and January, we frequently are down into the 20s or even sometimes teens. And while young cauliflower plants actually don't mind some cold weather, as you're getting close to harvest, as those heads are trying to develop, those heads are badly damaged by freezing weather, anything much under the mid-20s. So if you're growing cauliflower for winter harvest or overwintered for spring harvest, you must use some protection here in the Willamette Valley. Kohlrabi is typically a fall harvest crop, fall to early winter. It stands well in the garden because the part of the plant you're harvesting is actually an engorged stem. It's not really a root. They are somewhat less subject to a lot of the bug problems that the turnips and rutabagas get. So they actually hold in the garden better than most. They're super cold hardy and they can stand for a long time to pick as you need. A question in chat: when is the best time to add lime and soil to raised beds? So the best time to add soil to raised beds is any fallow period when you're not actively growing something in it. And usually about 2 weeks before you want to plant, depending on what you're adding in, but that allows some of these organic components of your soil to finish any decomposition cycle that's going on and not be allelopathic, not inhibit the germination of seeds or root development of new plants. Lime. So pH shifting lime is usually done either once or twice a year at spring or at fall. Type of lime does matter. Dolomitic limes are a little slower, but are a little more long-lasting. Calcium limes provide more active calcium, and some of them are really fast, so you can make sudden changes if need be. It often becomes more relevant when you talk about lime-requiring plants because of calcium rather than because of pH. So things like melons and cucumbers and tomatoes and peppers and squashes all suffer severe fruit symptoms from calcium deficiency. That's quite separate from actual soil pH. And you should lime them at planting and again in about 4 or 5 weeks after planting to make sure you have an adequate calcium supply through the growing cycle for production. So ground stored roots, beets, not all beets are equal. Most of them will ground store into October okay. Varieties like Flat of Egypt hold better, quite a bit better, and may hold into early December. Even your good ground storing varieties like Flat of Egypt do not hold well past maybe early December. So finish getting them out by then. That is quite separate from any issues you might be having with soil moisture or insect problems. It's just an aging out thing. With carrots, you can ground store them, but increasing rain starting usually in late October can cause splits, and both slugs and bugs damage them pretty severely. But they can hold into October, November, maybe into early December in most conditions. Rutabagas and parsnips are your new items on the list, and rutabagas are a brassica, like a cauliflower. So they are subject to a lot of insect depredation, both aphids and caterpillars in the leaves, but also root maggots in the roots, and a variety of soil insects, wireworms and such that tunnel in and damage the tuber. Rutabagas typically should be grown longer than turnips and sized longer than turnips. So if you're planting rutabagas and turnips at the same time in July, your turnips finish in September, your rutabagas finish in November, and they'll be about twice the size of the turnips at peak maturity. It can be as big as maybe 5 inches or so, maybe 6. But you do need to keep an eye on the insect populations. Other than the insect damage, rutabagas hold in ground very well. They typically are less subject to injury from inclement conditions. Parsnips are even less subject to both insect and storage problems or environmental conditions. Parsnips are really slow to germinate, and think of them like a carrot, because that's basically what they are. They're big white carrot that you harvest in January. So they take a long time to germinate. You have to have good deep soils. You have to have good moisture going down during their development cycle, so they develop appropriate roots. After that, they are kind of a leave alone. Let them sit in the ground until you need them, but you normally start harvesting them late November, early December, and could easily hold into January, February. Overwintered crops are kind of the smallest category here. There's only a few crops that are specifically designed to go from summer planting or fall planting over the winter for spring harvest. These do include some of the introductory level crops for overwintering gardening, which include onions and garlic. There are leaf crops, cole crops, root crops, and a few legumes that are suitable for overwinter gardening. So your typical overwintered leaf crops: corn salad, mâché or vite, arugula, similar mustard plants. A lot of them are super winter hardy. They would like some covers if you really want to get any winter production. They're typically or very commonly grown simply for their spring harvest. We already talked a bit about chard and kale as a biennial crop, planted anytime during the growing season, and then you harvest through the summer, fall, winter, and a bit into the spring growing cycle. What will happen as you're watching them is they'll get as big as they're going to get by October, with very small incremental growth thereafter. So that's the time you really need to watch your harvest, not over harvest them. Take a few leaves at a time as you're going. Very minimal visual changes from November, December, and January. Sometime in February, as your day length increases, even though the temperatures aren't very warm yet, the day length is getting substantially longer by February, and they start growing again. You can pick up the harvesting a bit then. And then late February to early March, they're going to be growing very vigorously, and you need to really watch the beginnings of the development of seed stalks. When you start seeing the first flowers, first attempts at seed flower buds out, no longer fight it. It's not worth the trouble of fighting at that point. That's the time to go ahead and harvest out, take the plants all the way out, harvest what's usable on them at that point, and then utilize that space for another crop. Spinaches with covers can be winter harvested. Even without covers, often make it through the winter for spring harvest, though covers do give you some protection. Watch the slugs on spinach over winter. They are very, very damaging. It's very hard to keep enough of them off long enough to get a good spinach crop. If you plant now, you can fall harvest, maybe light winter harvest, and then spring harvest. If you wait and plant in August, you really aren't going to have a fall harvest. You're going to have to wait until March, basically, for your significant harvest. The cole crops, as we talked about earlier, cabbages and cauliflower, they're the same types of cabbage, the same types of cauliflower. They're just different varieties. You plant them all at the same time. Some varieties harvest in the fall. Some varieties harvest December, January. Some varieties harvest between February and the end of March or first part of April. All planted at the same time. And cauliflower does need winter protection if you're overwintering it. Overwinter broccoli is different. You do not have a big-headed broccoli. You don't have that traditional big center head. Overwintered broccoli is sprouting broccoli. It grows taller, and it sets tons of little florets, maybe golf ball size at the upper end. And plantings done of sprouting broccoli now produce maybe February to March. You have a bit of a window of time to get them in, but even though you're not planning on winter harvesting them, they still have to get big enough to store enough energy to be vigorous as they push out the sprouts in the spring. Broccoli and cabbage are super hardy. They seldom need any winter protection here. Cauliflower is the exception in the group. Overwintered root crops. So these are a lot of what people think of and don't realize that they're doing overwintered planting. It's just, it is what the cycle is. Onions, and actually all onions, garlic, and shallots. The best time to plant them is in the early fall, let's say September. These are plants that are regulated by day length, not by how long they've been in the ground. So for our guests joining us from Texas and California, you don't grow the same onions as we do because you grow on a different growing cycle. We can't grow the onions you grow because of the difference in growing cycle and the day length. So typically we're talking about northern climate onions. You plant them from seed in June to July, or from seedling trays in July and August, or from bulb sets for some varieties in September through the midwinter. Regardless of type and how you're planting them, they will uniformly try to mature somewhere between the end of June and maybe the middle of July. I'm about half through pulling onions at home right now. And so if you start them earlier and they have more growing time, you will have bigger onions. And that's kind of the goal to the early plantings. You do have a window of making up for lost time, and it's actually one of the better ways to do onions. If you don't want to start the seed yourself, go through fighting them through the winter, if you don't want to plant the bulbs, which often have a higher percentage of failure just because of the way they're processed, the way the growing cycle runs, you can get green bunches of onions, at least of Walla Walla sweets, and sometimes it's storage onions like copra, usually around Valentine's Day, February, and going into maybe through the end of March or so. And that's a great way to do onions. It's simply commercial growers have started the seed in June, grown them on, harvested them out of sand beds, and sold them to us to sell to you. So you're paying a little higher price per unit, but you're paying for somebody to do that work and take those chances and have that success rate. So it's a great way to do onions if you're not going to start your own seed specifically. Garlic and shallots are almost exclusively done from bulbs. Planted usually about September. You can again plant them clear up through spring, but the sooner they get in the ground, the higher your yield is likely to be. Now, onions and garlic and shallots, even though they're a bulb and we think of them as being a high phosphorus plant because of that, their peak demand is for nitrogen. Feeding these plants is critical. And this applies at planting, where you want to do a good job, of course, of soil amending, fertilizing with a granular fertilizer. But because the window of time for them to develop is kind of short on the front end, it's a good idea as they start breaking the soil surface to maybe once or twice over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, give them a little bit of a liquid fertilizer. I don't like the synthetics. I like to use organics. We've got Gardner and Bloom's high nitrogen fertilizer, or Alaska Company's fish emulsion 511. But give them some nitrogen in the early part of their growing season so they can get the size they need to mature well. They will break ground soon after planting. They will grow through the early parts of the fall. By late fall, they'll kind of stop, again, as the day length gets short and temperatures drop. And they'll kind of take a resting state. It won't look like much is happening. But again, late January, early February, you'll start seeing them, notice that they're growing again. Another good time to provide liquid nutrients. So the thing with organic fertilization is that organic granular fertilizers require soil microbes to break down the components of that fertilizer into forms the plants can use. That's nothing wrong with that. It's a great approach. Feed the soil and let the soil feed the plants. But soil microbial activity is really low from about the end of October through about the end of February or so because of the low soil temperatures. So providing liquid nutrients, in other words, nutrients that are in a form the plant can use immediately without the mediation of soil microbes, is a more useful way to fertilize during those specific periods of time. And that's a good strategy for growing those. We talked about carrots as a fall crop and as winter holding. Most carrots decline pretty rapidly as we get into the later part of early part of winter and into the fall. There are exceptions. Merida, Autumn King is another variety, are intended for late plantings grown over the winter to harvest in maybe late March, early April. And provided your soils don't become so waterlogged that they can't, that's a good way to have some really early carrots in the spring. The catalogs and seed packages will talk about doing Meritas as a September-October planting. I've had pretty poor success going that late. Late August, early September is really a good time to put your Merida and Autumn Kings in for a spring harvest. It's about 200 days from seed overwintered, but you can also plant those same varieties in the spring at 75 days for a summer harvest. They are still suitable for that. They're just some of the few varieties that will actually grow through winter and still be a usable carrot in the spring rather than a tough fibrous mass. So legumes as an overwintered crop. Favas are the one that is traditionally done that way. You seed them in September, even as a cover crop or as a big seeded fava for spring production. And they'll grow up, they become nice, robust plants, and sometime late May to June would be typical harvest time for fava bean pods. There is some risk of freezing favas here. Doesn't happen very often. We can get cold enough, but even our last super cold snap, we had enough snow to protect them. They were under the snow when it got really cold. Our concern is when we have really cold snaps before the snow comes in, favas can freeze. They're at the bubble here. Peas are super hardy. You can even plant new peas in January. They can be grown as an overwintered crop, but there's a lot of things that can go wrong between October and March or April. So I wouldn't put huge amounts of space into overwintered peas. I wouldn't bet my entire pea crop on doing that. But it is doable in this way to get a few early season vegetables. You know, the cycle is traditionally that spring is starvation time. You know, in the fall and winter you have some late crops and you're still eating stores. By the time your spring is rolling around, you've gone through what you put up in storage, and the new crops just aren't ready yet. So it's nice to have a few things that are coming on. If you're overwintering peas, shellers and flat-potted snow peas do better because of their relatively short cycles in the first place. Don't try pole peas as an overwintered unless you're prepared to provide substantial structural support. The winter weather is just too hard on them. So shorter, stockier plants are better for overwintered peas. Seeded in September or even into early October will often produce a crop in roughly March to April for a pea crop, which is even a bit earlier than if you started them in January, but not by very much. So that kind of covers the crops. We're going to talk a little bit about how to put this together and how to make this work. First thing I always emphasize when we're talking about these types of succession plantings is crop rotations. It's important that you learn and understand the different families of vegetable crops because these families all share the same insect and disease problems. And to avoid catastrophic collapses of your crops, it's best to not plant related plants in the same soil year over year. You should move them around, not plant them in the same spot. So your big families you're concerned about in the talk we're having today are, of course, the alliums, your garlic, onion, shallot, but that also includes chives in that group. Should not be rotated sequentially. Your cole crops, and unfortunately this time we're talking about all the coles, all the brassicas. So broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, kale, but also turnips, radishes, and rutabagas are all brassicas. So are the mustards. So a huge variety of the potential fall and winter crops are brassicas. That's not normally a problem when you're dealing with them all as a coherent planting. You're just planting them near each other or farther away from each other and whatever. But a lot of the space that's often available post early plantings, a lot of things that are finishing up and allowing you space to indulge in fall and winter gardening are where things like cauliflower and cabbage came out. You should not use those spaces for another crop of cauliflower, cabbage, kale, or turnips or rutabagas. So keep in mind those rotations in that space. There's nothing wrong with intentionally leaving some space during your main spring planting cycle, so you have some space assigned for fall and winter gardening. It's a good strategy if you're going to do this as a year-round garden thing to keep it in mind. You can either completely fallow it with good layers of mulch. You can grow a short-turning cover crop on it, like buckwheat, and that you can then till in and then plant over. Strategies like that, but either allow the space in the first place, or if you're using space that has freed up, remember what was there so you don't duplicate that same family. Other families, the chenopod's, spinach and chard, are the dominant ones. There are a few others you're not too likely to see. Carrot family, carrots, parsnips, and parsley are carrot family, so don't inter-rotate them. Feeding is critical, and watering, because you are doing your planting in some of the toughest possible conditions to get new plants established. This often means if you're using automated irrigation that you actually have to go out and secondarily spot water new transplants or new seeded areas to make sure they're getting moist enough long enough, because they have very small or no root systems to start out with. This is particularly important for direct sowing. It takes quite a bit of moisture for seed germination. And of course, that will continue on these fall, winter, and overwintering crops until the rains set in, and that's usually mid-October or so here. It's important to fertilize at planting. It's also a really good idea to refresh your soil, add some additional organic mass and compost in. Because there's a really narrow window of time, I don't advocate using raw or manure products as your soil amendment in this cycle. Make sure you're using well-finished composts, because things that are kind of manure-y, whether that's a bulk soil that's brought in that's a mixture of partially decomposed manures and partially decomposed organic mass, or really fresh composts that are still chunky and warm, those are still breaking down. And the process of decomposition on those items will inhibit the growth of new plants going into them. It's a problem that corrects over maybe a 2 to 3 week window, but you don't have a spare 2 to 3 weeks this time of year to let the manures age in the ground before transplanting. So use finished compost to refresh your soil and soil structure if needed. Fertilize. I like organic granular fertilizers. That's my dominant feeding. And as we talked about a bit earlier with the onions and garlic, also applies really well to the cole crops because they are so hungry. Do some supplemental liquid feeding in the late summer and early fall to make sure they size up well so they're nice and well established before the growing conditions just get too poor for them to continue. Summer plantings are inherently subject to damage. So when you're planting in April and May, we don't have hardly any active insect population damaging the new plants, and slug populations are up but not at their peak. In an irrigated garden, your slug population is going to be very, very high in the summer and going to get worse as fall progresses. And we have a slew of insect problems that can completely eradicate your plants. So you need to really keep a close eye on things. Use good slug baits on your new plantings. I use iron phosphate baits like Sluggo because they're animal safe, organic. Use insect barriers. So insect barriers include things like light films. Remay brand makes one that's a summer weight insect. It's very much like their winter blanket, but it's lighter weight. And the goal here is to try to keep insects off the newly developing plants long enough to get them well established. I'm going to talk a little bit about the insects you're likely to have issues with. Everybody's pretty aware of the aphid and the cabbage butterfly or cabbage moth larvae, the caterpillars on the brassicas. Common problem on a lot of plants. And the insect barriers will help with them to reduce the population that's getting in and getting established. Lesser known are the maggots, and carrots and parsnips are often attacked by a carrot rust fly maggot. As its name suggests, a fly. They lay their eggs right at the soil, right at the base of a very newly emerged seedling, and the eggs hatch the larvae tunnel down into the root itself, doing tremendous amounts of damage. you should cover from the moment you see germination on those plants. I don't advocate covering before because, as I mentioned earlier, even the insect barriers sometimes block enough light to slow down the germination rate. But from the moment you start seeing germination, if you cover for about 3 to 4 weeks, that should eliminate the carrot rust fly maggot problem. The brassica maggots, the cabbage maggots, are also a significant problem on all of the traditional cole crops, kales, and also the root members of the brassicas, turnips and rutabagas. A similar insect pattern. Fly lays its eggs right against the stem. Larva burrows down in and feeds on the root system of the plant. And you'll notice you have a cabbage root maggot problem when your new plantings are about 5 or 6 inches tall and they just suddenly flop over at ground level. They do that kind of damage to the root system. Once you see the problem, it's mostly too late to fix the problem, and in many cases, it's getting too late to replant. So new transplants out or new seedlings developing up from the moment you see good germination should be covered. Once they're about 6 or 7 inches tall, they are past attack by a cabbage root maggot typically. So using some of those insect covers goes a long way to ensuring your success in your fall and winter garden. The single biggest cause of failure in winter gardening, fall, winter, and overwinter gardening is timing. Everybody does it too late. They're thinking about it too late, or they're realizing they have some space as things are finishing up way late in the season. You can't start the end of August, first part of September for most crops. You have to be starting now. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is how to time these crops correctly. Okay, touch on covers first. So we talked about covering your plants for insect activity, and then also covers for temperature covers. So insect barriers are great approach for that end of it. But for winter greens or for crops that need the winter protection like cauliflower, you need a heavier weight fabric or a clear plastic or similar type of material to actually trap a significant amount of temperature. You can see some examples of covers here in the photos. The small dome covers are good for a few greens, and they provide plenty of insulative value, somewhere around 6 or 7 degrees, even in a small dome like that. Great for growing small amounts of greens for the table. Too small to use for winter protecting cauliflower or larger plants, but very handy. On the left-hand picture there, you've got a floating row cover. It's got, this one has some wire hoops under it, and it's simply covering a row of young plants. You can do that approach with summer insect barrier. You can also do that you can get the thicker remade blankets or similar frost blanket materials and cover like that. You can, so those type of woven fabrics can actually be in contact with the foliage of the plants. They're light enough they can even often sit on top of the plants if they're well weighted down so the wind doesn't just blow them out without hurting the plants at all. You make sure you're not pushing down too much. Those plants are still slowly growing, but they can be in contact. They're not doing any harm. Clear plastic, you need to build some sort of a rigid frame, and the plastic should never be in contact with the plant parts. You will create burns where they connect. Clear plastics usually provide greater degree of insulation depending on the grade of plastic and whether it's a hard plastic or soft plastic, all kinds of composition factors. They can provide anywhere from about 3 to 5 to maybe 7 degrees of insulation from clear plastic. It's usually more around 4 or 5 degrees out of the spun fabrics at the high end, and maybe it might be as low as 2. For things that are on the bubble like cauliflower, that's not a problem. For things like greens, where you really want extra temperature in there, it's not a bad idea to look at some of the clear plastic covers or glass covers, even in small scale, to provide that extra level of temperature for continued growing. Okay, so here's how we cycle it out. June, I know we're past that, we'll talk about it briefly anyway. We're seeding. This is seeding for transplant or direct seeding. Almost all cole crops, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage. Fall carrots can be sown as early as June. Rutabagas can be sown as early as June. I usually do mine in early July, but as early as late June. Parsnips, because they take forever. They take forever to germinate. They take forever to grow. So they're a very long cycle crop. Don't delay getting them started. You can, and most root crops do not transplant well. You can't grow seedlings and then transplant them out because they develop those hair taproots very early, and they suddenly start binding in the trays or in the starter pots. And once those roots have bent, it's over. You're not going to have a good crop. So there are very few exceptions. You can do rutabagas from transplant. I do a lot of times. Orb type carrots and possibly beets can be done from transplant, but the longer taper rooting root crops cannot be done. You can still seed leeks, or you can transplant leeks in June. Transplanted leeks will be several weeks ahead of seeded. You can still seed Brussels sprouts, kale, chard, but they're easier to do from transplant. I strongly advocate you do them that way. And of course, starting seed indoors for transplant. By July, we're talking about, where we're in right now, we have still opportunity to direct seed spinach, onions, parsnips, carrots for fall still. We're coming to the tail end of that. Fall harvest peas, collard greens. You can either seed or transplant chard, lettuce, kale, radicchio. Lettuce is as easy to do from seed as it is to do from transplant, provided you don't bake them out. Chard and kale transplant much easier than they seed. And July is our major transplanting. So right now we get new plants coming in several times a week. You should be transplanting broccoli, cauliflower, and getting your crops established, whether they're for fall harvest, winter harvest, or overwinter. As we get into August, your opportunity to continue the garden declines pretty rapidly. You can continue to seed radishes, spinach, and quick germinating mustards like arugula and mache. I always use mache, but I mean corn salad vit, they're all the same plant, just different common names. Turnips can still be direct sown as late as August with good success. You can choose to either seed or transplant kohlrabi. I like to transplant by August. Kohlrabi can be done by seed. Bok choy, got a nice short cycle on most of those. Most other types of mustards as well, and lettuce. Generally speaking, you're coming to the end of the transplanting cycle. You're getting pretty late for fall harvest cole crops, but winter harvest and overwintering cole crops, kale, chard, leeks can still be planted. In areas that you are not winter gardening and your summer crops are finishing out, it's a good idea to utilize cover crops to improve your soil and reduce erosion. That's a whole separate class. We do a class on that coming up in about a month. If you're interested in the topic, you should start your cover crops as early as humanly possible. As individual plants start coming out in August, you can start direct sowing cover crops. Crops that are going to be in the ground for a very long time, like tomatoes, which will probably still be there in October. As you're getting into the August or early part of September, good idea to throw those cover crops in amongst the standing plants and let them get started. By the time you have time to plant them as those crops come out in late September, early October, you're not going to get good development on your cover crops anymore. It's too late. September and October, very few things still happening in planting the winter crops. Fava beans, overwintered peas, potentially overwintered carrots, though I like to do them a little on the earlier end of that cycle. Don't wait clear into October. Radishes can still be sown every few weeks up through early October. You can still seed, but by September or October, I really focus heavily on transplanting for mustards like hardy mustards like arugula and mache. September, October is your primary planting time of the bulb alliums, garlics, onions, and shallots from bulbs. And you still have time to transplant some leaf crops like lettuce. Spinach planted this late is not going to yield right away. It's going to be a spring yield. Chard and collard greens can still be transplanted as late as that. So that's your main vegetable thrust for this cycle. The rest of the garden, look at that cover cropping. Areas, if you're not cover cropping, if you're in raised beds, you don't want the hassle of tilling, or you're practicing no-till gardening, rather than cover cropping, consider mulching, whether that's aged manures. It's a good time to put manure on as you're putting the garden to bed. For fresh manure, it'll compost down. If you're using well-aged manures, things that have really had a couple of years of decomposition, do them in the spring instead, or you're not gaining the nutrient benefit. But all kinds of mulch covers like that to reduce erosion, reduce weed problems, and help your garden soil be as intact as possible for spring. Cover crops are also useful for deterring some pests, certain insects, so a valuable tool. It's also not a bad idea as you're coming to the end of your summer cycle to think forward. Do you want to push your early plantings out? You can do peas as early as January, lettuce potentially as early as February, but we're in a very wet climate that time of year. And for the most part, you're gonna have trouble doing that in soils that are either underwater, part of my garden sometimes is in January, or so saturated that the seed rots faster than it germinates. So if there are areas that you're thinking about doing some very, very early winter planting, this would be a good idea in the fall to create the structure and cover that's going to keep the rain off of them so they can dry out and develop faster in the late winter and early spring. All right, so that's what I had for you guys for the presentation, and I've got a few questions in chat, and then we'll talk about opening up for verbal and see what you guys have for me. So question in chat, where can you purchase plastic dome covers? It's really hit and miss. We had the Haxnix covers for a while. Sales were not dramatically great, so we sometimes have them and sometimes don't. You can make very simple plastic covers with sheet plastic and either wooden frame or hoop frame, PVC hoop frame, and that's probably the most common thing we see is people making their own little hoop covers and covering them over. Check around the department stores. Check around all your local garden centers. Garden centers have more of that type of product than most of your department stores, and it's just hit and miss what the economics of the game for the immediate area are. Okay. Question, in Boise, Idaho, having problems with tomatoes not getting ripe. People are saying it's the excessive heat. Is that correct? Could be. So what happens with excessive heat on tomatoes? Tomatoes are a hot season crop. They love heat. When you start breaking 100, you start having some problems with tomatoes. One of the problems you start having with tomatoes is the flowers burn off. And so if you're getting no fruit, in other words, it's not actually setting, it could be excessive heat. Tomatoes that are on plant normally will not fail to ripen because it's too hot. But what will happen is when it's hot, people throw water and more water and more water at their tomato plants. And that slows the ripening sequence. It promotes more vegetative growth. A couple of steps of correction: back off the watering. Boise is different from Corvallis. 90% of my tomatoes I grow in the garden are unirrigated. I watered them once in May at planting. They're still fine after 110 degrees, one day of 110 degrees with 20-mile-an-hour winds. But soils matter, and we don't have the prolonged dry heat that you do. Typically, we have some humidity with it. So you probably can't get away with that where you're at, but you can back down the watering. That will slow the vegetative growth and will increase the ripening sequence on the tomatoes. Option number 2, tipping the tomatoes. They're not ripening because they're continuing to push new vegetative growth and new flowers. If they realize they're no longer able to push new vegetative growth and new flowers, they will try to ripen the fruit they have. Step number 2. Step number 3, next year plant shorter cycle tomatoes. I kind of get frustrated with everybody, and again, it's a little different for you, wanting to grow these 100-day maturing beefsteak tomatoes in Western Oregon. It's not the right crop for our area because we don't have the heat to successfully ripen them year over year. Not impossible, just why fight it when there are great 75 and 80-day tomatoes that ripen just fine here. So those are all factors you want to keep in mind. If your tomatoes are setting but not ripening, it's not likely to be strictly about the heat. It's likely to be about fertility, watering, and the like. A comment in chat: pipe bender to make your hoop covers. That's a good approach if you're handy and have access to the equipment. Question on the chat, and I always get this one on these: will the recording be available to rewatch, please? And yes, so it might be it might happen today, but more likely it'll be a couple of days. One of my staff will post this on our YouTube channel. for Chenard's. You can link to it from chenards.com, or you can hunt us down on YouTube. And there's a batch of other classes we've done on there. I mean, that's one of the things that we can be thankful for COVID for, is now we have a very large video library of classes we've run on fruit tree pruning and vegetable gardening and beekeeping and all of that. I want to thank you all for attending. It's good to have a good turnout for a vegetable class. It's kind of my passion, as you can see, and so thanks all. I am around if you need to do any follow-up questions. Darren, D-A-R-R-E-N, @chenards.com gets to me, and I'd be happy to follow up any questions for you. I'm going to end it now for the day. Thank you very much.